What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick, and I am back with a collection update. In fact, the first collection update of 2025. So generally with these earlier collection updates, it's a lot of stuff that I missed from last year, but I also have some stuff from the Metalhead box, some random pickups, and some cool stuff that was sent to me by some cool bands. So yeah, let's just get into this one and kick off in gross fashion with Repuked and their album Club Squirting Blood. This is the fourth album from this Swedish death metal act. Actually, it came out late last year. I thought about doing a review for it. We just didn't have time. And by then I was really working on my year-end list. I got in this band with their last album, Dawn of Reintoxication, and this is just some foul, depraved HM2 death metal, but almost kind of death grind, sort of like kind of mishmash. Pretty much imagine like Autopsy, Rotten Sound, and Death Breath kind of all whirled into one band, and you would have this band. Just mix in some vomit and other bodily fluids, and yeah, no, it's pretty much the perfect description. This band is almost kind of like the HM2 equivalent of Exhumed. Lots of vocal trade-offs. Again, it's a little bit grindy. The guitars definitely have a HM2 tone to them, but they're very dirty, they're very sizzly, they sound like they were like deep fried in bile. Fiercely old school, lots of like crusty elements in there, like crust punk, like songs like Parasitic Flesh, Dead Existence for Humiliation, I think that's what it says. All the song titles are written in this lovely font that's really hard to read. Again, the vocal trade-offs I thought definitely gave it like an Exhumed flavor. You get these like deeper, almost more like grunted vocals, and then like some higher screams, and then, well, I mean, like kind of a pukey delivery too. Like there's a lot of like retching and heaving in the vocals, which is totally expected with a band called Repuked. You do get some slower, more groove-laden moments every now and then. The title track is a little bit slower. It does have a club music end to it, which I thought was fun. And probably one of the other ones that's a little bit more groove-laden is Into the Anal Abyss. But as I said, most of this is, very fast-paced. Again, a lot of like just flat-out punk riffs mixed in here, like the song Crotch Rot. Honestly, it's predominantly a punk song with just some like metal accents every now and then. That one in particular I would say is like very comparable to like Autopsy, Abscess, stuff like that. Overall, this is a lot of fun. It's kind of goofy, silly, over the top, gross as hell. I mean, that is exactly what you should expect from a band called Repuked. And yeah, I dig it. If you are not familiar with this band, honestly, this isn't a bad place to start. Their last one I thought was pretty good. Those are the only two I've heard by them. But yeah, if you're a big fan, again, of Autopsy, Abscess, again, like a little bit of like HM2 death metal, like, Entombed, Dismember, and again, Exhumed too, check this out. Pretty solid album. Dimmu Bongir, Dark Medieval Hash. This is the second album from this Norwegian black metal / parody act. This is one I got in the Metalhead box, and I couldn't make out the logo, but luckily the comments helped me out, and this is really interesting. It's pretty much like early Dimmu / early Satyricon, and then weed. Now, I'm pretty sure all the themes are weed. Some of the lyrics are Norwegian, some of the lyrics are in English. I'm reasonably sure they're gonna stick the theme throughout, otherwise the name would just seem pointless. Musically, I would say this band goes for a more like early symphonic-ish melodic black metal sound, like again, like Dimmu Borgir. Satyricon, though I wouldn't call them like super melodic, at least the earlier stuff, but bands like Ancient, and I would even say Naglfar. The production is very much in that vein too. It's very raw. The synths on here are really loud. Like they kind of jump way out into the forefront, even kind of drowning out the guitars at certain points. But it does have like a lot of good, solid melodic riffs in here. The title track, and forgive me, some of these are going to be hard to read because they're in Norwegian. I do like the song Death Kush. That's a pretty fun, punky song. I actually really dig that one. The 8th track, Taka Legelse Og Rocketrang. I'm sorry, that's probably not even close. I do like that song. Really solid riffs in there, like a little like thrashy touch to it. And Bongrin's Hammer Del 2. The opening track is called Bongrin's Hammer Del 1. It's more of an intro, but the last track is more of like a lavish track, like it's, you know, like honestly, I think one of the longer tracks on here. So yeah, there are some songs in here I really dig, but like the whole album overall, I don't know, it's kind of odd. Like the clean vocals feel a bit off, like, you know, occasionally like off the mark in terms of like, you know, the key, but also off in terms of like the vibe because they feel extra silly. And I realize, you know, this is a parody act, so silliness is, well, I mean, at least it should be welcome. But throughout this, I felt like this was almost like halfway between a tribute and a parody. It does feel serious at times in terms of the composition, but then it'll go headlong into just outright silliness, and it kind of loses me a little bit. Also, I felt like the drum work on here was really monotonous, like it's a lot of static blast beats, and the drum production on here is not great. It's a very thin drum sound. Again, they probably wanted like an early black metal thing, and well, early black metal is really not known for having great drum production. But after a while, it kind of got boring, and it kind of held the songs back. I do think there's some cool stuff on here. I don't know if I would actually check out their first album, but this was interesting at least. You don't hear a lot of black metal parodies, generally because I think that subgenre takes itself way too seriously too often. But this was pretty fun. If you're a big fan, again, of like early Dimmu, Naglfar, Ancient, it really reminded me a lot of Ancient. And again, like a little bit of Satyricon too. Check this out, it was pretty fun. Plaguefever, Flail of Pestilence. This is the second album from this Virginia-based black and thrash metal act. Features Andy Horn of Mammoth Grinder and Crossspitter, and at least in terms of lead work on here, Nick Polos from Municipal Waste. This was yet another one that I got in the Metalhead box, and this thing is absolutely ripping. First off, the title track, which kicks this off, almost comes in like a jump scare. You instantly get cold, icy riffs, this creepy spoken word, and then it is off to D beats and just savage, thrashy riffing. In terms of like a fusion of thrash metal and black metal, this leans, I would say, more on black metal, especially in terms of production and atmosphere. It sounds cold, it sounds icy, it sounds sinister. The vocals on here are particularly snarling but well enunciated. Honestly, it reminded me a lot of Marduk, but musically, I got like a lot of early Bathory, Art Noir, and a little bit of like Toxic Holocaust, especially when they kind of like strip it down, get a little bit more punky and a little bit more loose. Love the guitar tone on here. It's raw, it's sizzly, it's got a great crunch to it. And in terms of like songwriting here, like this isn't necessarily just like kind of the more D-beat oriented stuff where it's just kind of go for the throat on every track. Like, trust me, there's plenty of D-beats, but there's a lot of dynamics in terms of their songwriting. You get songs that are a little bit more epic and sinister, and then just like flat out rippers that are out just fuck shit up. Songs like Spear, Grim Pickings, Night Torment, lots of just tight, gnarly thrash riffs with, again, that blackened atmosphere. But when it comes down to like the more mid-tempo songs, or at least the songs that have more mid-tempo sections, got Old Believers and Taste the Chain. Taste the Chain, that riff I could listen to for ever. Honestly, it's just like one of those riffs that is just instantly hooky. It's got this anthemic stomp to it. It's got this just awesome death march groove to it. And again, that riff is so infectious. It's a sleazy, satanic fist bumper. I could listen to that song all day. You also have some more like dissonant cold tracks like Bloody Tools, 340 Skulls. That's a pretty specific number. Those dissonant riffs definitely give the songs a little bit more atmosphere. They sound a little bit more sinister. Across the board, I dig everything on here. This album is flat out fun. It's packed with riffs. It's got loads of blackened atmosphere. It's got that old school kind of like Bathory snarl to it. Dig it across the board. And I definitely want to find more by this band. So yeah, if you're a big fan, again, of Art Noir and early Bathory, I would say especially, and even in some of the more like melodic parts on here, I would say Skeleton Witch as well. Check this album out. Killer stuff. Gnawing Void, The Spiraling Decline. This is the debut album from the Cincinnati-based blackened death metal act. Features at least one ex-member of Valdrin, and interestingly enough, I am related to one of the members, at least by marriage. My buddy, guitarist Evan Johnson in here, who I think is my cousin. I don't know. It's by marriage, and there's like a complicated like flow chart, whatever. He was telling me about his project for a while and said, hey man, I'd love to send you a CD, and lo and behold, he did. It was a while ago. Sorry it took so long, man. And I was really excited to hear this because he and I bonded over like multiple bands, and I definitely feel like some of those bands that he brought up that we both like are on here. This is More death metal leaning in terms of like the fusion here. Like this definitely has more of like a death metal aggression here, but lots of distance, lots of atmosphere, but also just a ton of straightforward crushing riffs. The drum work on here is aggressive. It's really solid, especially on Malignant Presence. That whole opening drum flurry on there I really loved. But what I really liked is this kind of aggressive death metal sound mixed with a lot of distance. I know he's a big fan of Vitriol, but honestly, I would say if I was going to compare this to a particular band, I would say it's very similar to Hate Eternal, and by extension, Morbid Angel, but mostly Hate Eternal because Hate Eternal has that just unrelenting aggression and how they work in dissonant riffs in there. I feel like this kind of echoes that. The vocals in here, I really dig this guy's delivery. It's very intelligible and it sounds just ultra sinister. I also like the use of like cleaner passages on top of like just absolutely savage riffs. A lot of like Blut incantation or spectral voice where they just do those like single notes that they play and just add a ton of reverb over them to make it sound just more haunting and sinister. And while I would definitely describe this as like very technical because there's lots of riff changes, lots of intricate transitions, they still know how to lay on a solid groove like Artificial Promised Land and Perdition in particular. Just nasty grooves, and in terms of like a good syncopated, like almost like decapitated style, sort of like chuggy breakdown, Born by Filth. That song absolutely crushes. That song also delivers like some really solid melodies as well, and a solid lead too. A lot of this is just heavier than hell, but I do like that they inject some like, you know, catchy hooks every now and then mix it up with like the more like dissonant atmosphere too. It gives this album like a really complete feel because across the board, like I feel like the songs are like really different from one another, which is awesome. It kept this album interesting from start to finish. There's a good balance of influences on here where, again, you get something a little bit more melodic, something a little bit more technical, something that has a little bit more of a blackened flavor. Sometimes it's just blasty and violent, like the title track, which closes this out. So yeah, thank you once again, Evan, for sending me this. Sorry it took so long for me to get to it. But yeah, if you guys are big fans of Morbid Angel, Hate Eternal, in terms of more blackened band in here, I don't know, I would say like maybe like Belphegor or like, you know, that death metal period of Behemoth too. Check this out. This is really killer. Thank you again, man. Wombbath, Tales of Madness. This is the 5th album from this Swedish death metal act. Yeah, pretty much like underground legends in the scene. Anyway, this was actually released on my birthday in 2020, which was kind of cool, but in terms of like stuff I'm missing from Wombbath, I think I just have The Great Desolation left. And this was an interesting album in the sense that this is both new tracks and re-recorded old tracks. This was kind of how they announced that they were coming back by re-recording some old songs, namely from their early demos, and then showing off some new songs to show off the new direction of the band, which honestly really wasn't that much different than the previous direction. So anyway, the first 3 tracks in here, Tales from the Dark Side, Brutal Mites, and Unholy Madness, are all from their demos, and they did a solid job re-recording them, especially when it came down to the production too. They kept it raw, they kept it dirty, they wanted it to sound, again, like more of a throwback HM2 death metal sound, and totally captured it. Now, I definitely know these demos because I have the special edition re-release of their first album, and those include the demos, and they did a good job. Again, keeping the production gritty and raw and more of like a throwback 90s HM2 death metal sound. It kept those songs feeling very classic. Now, when it came down to the new tracks, again, not much changed. Like the production across the board, I would say, is universal. They really didn't change much in the settings when it came down to re-recordings and the new songs. I might say that there's a little bit more in the way of dynamics and possibly aggression in terms of the newer songs. Lavatory Suicide Remains, that's a hell of a title. A little bit more in the way of like transitions and like sinister melodies. The blast beat sections in there feel way more aggressive than, you know, at least like the earlier material. It kind of has like a more modern death metal sort of flair to it. The songs are just like a little bit bigger. They're a little bit more grand. Again, they're longer. There's more in the way of transitions. There's more in the way of technical play. Transitional atmosphere is also sort of a big thing between the tracks too. But again, they found a good balance where it still sounds 100% like old school Swedish death metal, which is exactly what I signed up for with this. So yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting album in the sense of like making a comeback, because they kind of did something that kind of bridged like the old fans, the new fans, But again, they didn't change that much, but they changed enough to just, let you know, like, yeah, there's going to be some new wrinkles in the formula from here on in. And honestly, the album after this one, I flat out love. Like, it's almost on par with, like, some of my favorite shit from, like, Bloodbath. But yeah, if you like bands like Bloodbath, Dismember, Entombed, Grave, stuff like that, check this album out. Solid stuff. Acid Mass, Worship. This is the second album from this one-man Cincinnati thrash metal act. I became a fan kind of all at once. I got an Acid Mass shirt in the Metalhead box a while ago. I found a copy of their first album, and I figured, hey, it's just time to get this second album too. I pretty much love everything about this band. Snarling, old school, riff-centric thrash metal. The songs are meat and potatoes, but they are just explosive and vicious. The production is very raw. Honestly, it kind of feels like a live performance. The vocals all have this very strange distortion on them where it sounds like the dude's screaming into a bucket, but honestly, it fits. Everything about this band is just vicious at all times. Very comparable to bands like Wraith, Hellripper, Toxic Holocaust, and definitely Slayer. In fact, Stench of Death, it almost kind of sounds like Chemical Warfare at a certain point. Now, in comparison to the first one, I do think that this one is a little bit more varied in terms of the tempos and like the dynamics and such. Like, of course, you get just disgusting barn burners, The Mouth of Hell, War Machine, Final Surrender, and the title track, all just scathing, fast. But there's a little bit more in the way of like groove and some different rhythms, like you get some good gallops here and there, but it doesn't change their sound overall. Like, they still have that just vicious old school thrash sound throughout. It's just a little bit more mixed up, and I think that kind of helps with the pacing where the songs don't run into each other as much. And in terms of like, all the comparisons I made to all those bands, you get some guests from a lot of those bands. Matt from Wraith, Ash from Faith Extractor, another cool Cincinnati-based band, and James McBain from Hellripper all show up in here and contribute vocals. And while I would say with like the distortion on there, it can be kind of hard to make out like where the vocal changes are because it's just, kind of like a more like, just monotonous grunt with like a little bit of distortion on it. It's still really cool that all these guys participated. You even get a couple of moments of blast beats on here too that kind of surprised me. Nuclear Exorcism and Hell from Above. Not quite like death metal or death thrash or like even like blackened thrash sort of blast beats, but just like good solid blast beats just kind of backing up these just savage riffs. Yeah, I flat out dig this album. This is just a lot of fun. It's riffs, it's grooves, it's kind of boiled down to its most like primal elements, and it just flat out fucking works. If you love pretty much any of the bands that I brought up here, as well as like Nuclear Assault too, I'll throw them into, check this album out. Check out their first album. Incredible band. I definitely want to see this band live sometime, so hopefully they come up around my area, because since he's a bit of a haul for me. But yeah, check him out. Blut aus Nord, Disharmonium, Undreamable Abysses. This is the 14th album from this French avant-garde black metal, black and death metal, dissonant everything. I don't know what to call this band. Black metal seems appropriate. Avant-garde does too. Anyway, this is the first time that Blut aus Nord has crept its way into my collection in years. I initially bought their album Mort when it came out, and I listened to it and then traded it for something else. It was one of the few times that I've actually traded in an album, because at that point, I just was not into like dissonant, atonal, anything. I just wanted riffs. Now, many years later, we actually reviewed the follow-up to this album, Nahab, which was a nightmarish hellscape of dark, twisting, dissonant riffs and blast beats and soundscapes that I struggle to like actually describe, especially when we found out that synths were not involved with that album at all, because there's some sounds on there that I just can't really process that that's actually a guitar. But while we were jamming that one, we actually went back and listened to a little bit of this one, and I found this one a little bit more accessible than Nahab. It's still dark, it's still twisted, it is still layered and dense. It's almost like impenetrable when it comes down the sound, because I feel like every conceivable like area of sound is just covered in this thick miasma of dissonance. But melody-wise, I find this a little bit more approachable. Like, there's just, I think, more interesting construction in the songs. It doesn't kind of go off the rails as much as Nahab did. And I'm going to take this awesome slipcover off, show off the other art and also all the track names on here, so that'll be handy. But this album, I don't know, like I found it more approachable. Like the dissonant melodies work a little bit more in the way of like hooks, like similar to Ulcerate. You know, Ulcerate I think are kind of the masters of making dissonance catchy. But these guys just do things so differently. Like the drum performance on here is otherworldly, but also just confusing because there's like lots of these crazy off-time fills. But again, you're working with like riff structure that is, well, beyond contemporary here. But in terms of the soundscapes these guys generate, that blows me away. The vocals are haunting, dark. They feel like they're moving around in the mix, kind of giving you that like feeling you're surrounded by them, which I imagine was exactly what they were going for. But some of the guitar melodies in here are just strange. Into the Woods in particular, there is a repeated melody on there where the guitars almost sound like haunting whale songs. It's like they followed like the most like depressed group of humpback whales they could find and like, yeah, let's record that and then loop that through some weird filters and shit and see what we can turn that into. As long as it gives our fans nightmares, I think we're good. Neptune's Eye also has these like haunting choirs, like it's almost kind of like, you know, the score to The Omen being played behind all this just unnerving, unsettling, atmospheric, black death. I don't know what to call this band. And that's kind of their thing. Their career, as I am, you know, slowly starting to dive more into it, is all over the place just in terms of like having a series of albums follow a particular theme and even a particular sound, and then going into another one that is just completely different than the last one. But I think that works to their benefit because, you know, not being able to be described and being a Lovecraftian horror themed band, that's just kind of perfect there. The droning, swarming riffs on That Cannot Be Dreamed, Kezia Mason, and the last track, The Apotheosis of the Unnameable. There's even some moments where they kind of open it up for like just like a little bit of a breakdown. So there are moments to kind of like anchor you back in when you're kind of getting lost in all this like dense fog of Cthulhu gas or whatever it is. And if I was to make like a slight complaint, but honestly it still kind of works, is that sometimes the vocals are very hard to hear. They kind of blend in with all the droning ambience and dissonance and just all the soundscapes on here. But I don't know, like at points like them just being sort of like a muttered thing in the background, it kind of adds the experience. It kind of makes it even more hypnotic. I really dug this, and I wasn't necessarily like the biggest fan of Nahab, though I did still enjoy it on some level. This I enjoyed way more. So yeah, I think I'm going to get some more Blut aus Nord in my collection at some point. But yeah, this was a really intense, dark listen that I have come back to quite a few times. And yeah, if you're a big fan of, I mean, Ulcerate is kind of comparable. I guess Deathspell Omega, I don't know. Like, it's just kind of hard to say with this band. It kind of depends on when you catch them too. But yeah, I would recommend this one flat out if you've never heard them before. This is quite the listening experience. Cimmerian Possession, Sadistic Storm. This is the debut EP from this Mexican death metal act, kind of a blind buy for me. Features current and former members of Ravenous Death, Remains, and In Obscurity Revealed. I saw this was on Personal Records. I really have grown to like that label, so I decided to snag it because it was very modestly priced. And this is just some flat-out, gnarly, old-school death metal. Well, the opening track in here definitely opens with more of a ominous, sort of like Death Doom vibe. There's, you know, some really dreary harmonies in there. Honestly, it kind of reminded me a bit of Mortifferum. Most of this album is pretty fast, like lots of blast beats. There's still some heavy grooves. Riffs. My God, this whole EP is chock full of riffs. All 4 tracks in here. Giant riffs. And a good variety of them too. While, you know, this is definitely old school death metal, it definitely goes down a lot of different avenues in old school death metal. Like you have your more punky D-beat sections that definitely show up on Castles and Flames, the first 2 tracks. There's still a lot of that more like technical, more nuanced stuff that you would hear from like Morbid Angel and such too later on. Lots of blast beats mixed in. The production's very raw and gritty, again very akin to like 90s death metal. But the last 2 tracks, The Wrathful and Bringer of Night, Those both kind of explore a little bit more of their sound, like there's definitely some more atmosphere to it. Wrathful is a little bit more slow and brooding to start. There's some really awesome, creepy lead harmonies on there. There's not a lot in the way of like, flat out solos on here, but they do make good use of like lead harmonies to add a lot of atmosphere, and they're generally more sinister, and I wouldn't necessarily describe them as like flat out dissonant, but they definitely have like a more evil tone to them. But that song has like a good setup with the slower start, and then it shifts into just like flat out machine gun riffs, blast beats, super aggressive. And Bringer of Night, which might be a cover, they have Noctifier in parentheses, that might be the band they're covering. I couldn't find anything in the way of like, notes in terms of like liner notes, because they don't have really much in here. But that song notably more thrashy, like it kind of has like a Malevolent Creation sort of vibe to it. So within this short 4-track EP, there's a fair amount of variety, but it all stays fiercely old school and 90s. Really not much else to say about this one, just because it is a shorter offering, but I dig it. Like, it is just flat out solid death metal. Like, if you're a fan, again, like Morbid Angel, Malevolent Creation, Skeletal Remains, there's a lot of stuff in here that I would definitely compare to Skeletal Remains to. Check this EP out. This is really solid. Diocletian, Inexorable Nexus. This is the 5th album from this New Zealand-based blackened death metal act / war metal act. Again, like, the war metal label, I don't know where to really place it. Half the time I'm just like, yeah, no, it's blackened death metal, except it's like way more aggressive. Anyway, I've been a fan of this band since their album Gnawing, which I still think is probably my favorite in terms of what I've listened to by this band. And admittedly, I didn't even know this one came out. Like, I was shopping around my local record store and I was like, oh wow, that's a Diocletian album that I don't own, and oh my god, it is actually new. So obviously I snagged it, and this is pretty solid. Though, again, Gnawing kind of set like a really high benchmark for me, just in terms of like production, sound, riffs. Like, I really think that album is super well put together, like pretty much New Zealand's equivalent to like Titan Blood. This, way more raw, way more like kind of dialed down in terms of the production. Little compressed, I will say. Like, the sound feels really squeezed. Almost a little demo-ish at times, honestly. Like, it's definitely not about any sort of like polish on here. Like, this definitely sounds way more raw, way more gritty, but there's still like solid riffs, good atmosphere, the outright hostility of the vocals and the pace of this, which is predominantly blast beats. It definitely keeps this album very charged with energy throughout. The vocals, while aggressive, there's like this static filter on there where they sound like they're kind of crackling a little bit. Tons of dive bombs all over here, like really not like solos, but I mean, solos are not really a war metal thing, but yeah, the dive bombs, very frequent. Again, tons of blast beats. I will say that they do get a little static at points where it's just kind of like the same pulse, throughout the album. But there are good sections of groove. And when they do get into these groovier sections, it kind of has like a Celtic Frost, like Hellhammerish vibe, where the riffs are simple, chuggy, heavy, lethal, and the grooves are a little bit more lumbering. And there are occasionally some more technical flourishes in the riffs that kind of give it like a little bit more dynamic. Heathen Siege, Subjugation Before Annihilation. There's some Angel Corpse-esque sort of riff work in there too that I really enjoyed. Repuked and Violent Eradicating Hammer Strike definitely have like a little bit more like flat out death metal to them. Like, it just kind of has like more of a death metal bite to it. And Barbaric Hunt in particular has like what I feel like is almost like a Slayer nod. There's like this wah guitar build up, and then you get this big like Tom Araya scream. But while there are some like spots in here that I think are really dynamic, I do think that it does get a little static from song to song. Like, they do kind of run together because you have a lot of similar song structure and a lot of similar rhythms on here. Heathen Siege is probably my big standout. I do think that atmospheric section with all of the battle noises of swords and shields clanging, it kind of does go on a little bit too long, but there's some really good transitions into like some more like trad metal harmonies in there. Kind of opens up the song a little bit. I like this one. I mean, I probably would take Gnawing over this one, but I do think this is pretty solid throughout. It's good at what it does. It's barbaric, it's mean-spirited, it clubs you over the head with pretty much every single song, but there is a little bit of nuance on here. If you're a big fan of, again, like Revenge and like, I guess, like war metal in general, I don't know a tremendous amount of war metal bands to name drop here, but I don't know, honestly, if you just like hyper aggressive blackened death metal, check this band out, check out this album. I do recommend Gnawing though over this one if you're just gonna dive into this band. That's a really good starting point. But yeah, check this one out. Enchantment, Dance the Marble Naked. This is the debut album from this English death doom act. Originally came out in 1994. This is the 2020 reissue on Transcending Records. And I've been meaning to get this one for a while because this actually features a member of the YouTube metal community whom I actually follow. Mark G with a C. I had known about this band for a while. It was just, I hadn't got around to getting a copy of it. And generally anytime I see Mark put up a video, like, oh yeah, I gotta find that Enchantment album eventually. Which his Saw is the Law series is awesome. I mean, he and I definitely have a mutual worship of that amazing buzzsaw tone. But yeah, this is awesome. This is very much in line with the like peaceful death doom sound. It's, you know, more melancholic and dreary, though there are really solid sections of just straight up old school death metal on here. A good mix of like depressive guitar harmonies, woeful synths, and these huge bellowed vocals. In fact, the vocals really remind me a lot of like, you know, Barney Greenway early on in Napalm Death, and I would also say like Dave Ingram from Benediction. They're more of this like roared bellow. They're huge, they're prominent, they stand out big time. They're also maybe a bit over the top, but I don't know, I kind of dug them. There's also like some spoken word stuff in here that was really cool, but the thing that I really liked on here is the music. Really well constructed. The songs are generally longer, but they don't drone on too long on certain parts. They actually break this up with a lot of clever transitions, and I really like how they work the synths in. They're not just there as like a background instrument, they are worked into the music really well. There's some really good harmonies with the guitars too. And there are flat out beautiful melodies on here. My Ocean's Vast, the end of that song, I love that melody. Like that is just instantly hooky and instantly sad. That song, as well as Godsend and the closing instrumental Meadows, absolutely beautiful, somber, dreary, you know, all the adjectives that I probably already used. Just excellent songwriting. The guitar harmonies across the board on this album are probably one of my favorite things. I don't think there's like a tremendous amount of like flat out solos, but their use of guitar harmonies, they're frequent. It's like ultra depressed Iron Maiden, and I absolutely love it. There's also some stuff that kind of goes outside of the death doom spectrum, like Godsend. Well, you know, most of it I would definitely describe as death doom. There's like a really gnarly D-beat section that kind of just feels more in line with like just old school 90s, late 80s death metal. And Summer for the Dames, there's a start-stop like blast beat section on there where it's just kind of got this like little hitch in it. Again, like a little bit more aggressive, and I wouldn't describe like all this as like super aggressive. Again, it's very woeful and dreary, and you know, again, all the adjectives I've already used. So hearing some really nice aggressive sections on here, I thought was really cool. And this being the reissue, this also includes their demos too, which were a little bit different, and honestly, you can hear more of like just straight up death metal in there. There are some songs that definitely made it to the final cut in terms of like, you know, making it to the full length, Godsend in particular, but you could hear it's just a little bit different. The vocal approach is a bit different too, and there's just like a little bit more aggression to it. Same thing with Lucis Naturæ, I'm not sure if I said that right, and Amidst the Morning Wake, especially that song. That song is just flat out death metal, pure and simple. Now, I believe this was all remastered, and I think the remaster sounds great on the album. I don't know if they did anything to the demos, because the demos are super muddy. There's this prominent analog hiss that you hear throughout it, but again, it's a demo from the 90s. Those things are kind of expected, and I'm mostly there for the music overall, and I really dig this. This is just some absolutely killer death doom. If you're a big fan of like Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, Anathema, but also again, like a little bit like Benediction too, check this out. I believe this band is still around too. I think they reformed not too long ago, so I definitely want to check out more by them. I think they did have a fairly recent release. I don't know. Mark, let me know what's going on with the band, and I will gladly pick up more because this is killer. Immolation, Hope and Horror. This is, I believe, the first EP that these New York legends of death metal ever did. I was stoked to find this one. This one's been kind of hard to find. Saw it in the used CD rack at my local CD store. I was like, yes! Now, I mostly just wanted the 3 tracks that are on here. This was like kind of a teaser to Shadows on the Light, which I mean, that's not my favorite Immolation album, but I still like it. Immolation's just grossly consistent, and I would even say, like, even in their weaker moments in their discography, it's still pretty good. Now, I haven't watched the DVD yet just because I've seen Immolation like 6, 7 times. They absolutely crush live. There's no doubt that this, live performance is fucking amazing. But the 3 songs in here I'd never heard, and honestly, all 3 of them are very different. Den of Thieves, the opening track, is very much kind of what I expected from Immolation. The dissonant riffs, the crazy drum work, Rob's just strange riff construction and patterns, Ross's nasty vocals. It's pretty much Immolation. I would say the production is a little bit, on the muddy side. And, I'm not the biggest fan of the production on Shadows in the Light either. Kind of the same mix there. But it's a solid Immolation track. Now, The Condemned, I thought was really interesting because, honestly, it's almost kind of single-ish. Like, in the sense that it's one of the catchier songs I think I've heard in terms of, like, this era of Immolation. It's got some good tribal grooves to it. There's some, like, really flat-out hooky riffs. It's also not as technical, too. Like, this kind of almost doesn't sound like Immolation, but it still does. That's kind of an odd comparison there, but you listen to it, and this definitely feels like, something they wrote that would have, like, maybe a slightly broader appeal, but they did it in such a way where it doesn't, like, sacrifice the identity of the band. Really enjoyed that track, but honestly, it's the 3rd track, The Struggle of Hope and Horror, that I think is, like, the best one on here. It's an all-instrumental track, and honestly, I think it's like one of their like most interesting tracks I think they've ever written. More melodic lead work. It's almost kind of progressive death metal in a way. Like the transitions feel a lot different than a lot of their work. It just flows very differently. And again, like the riff work on here not being as like dissonant and atonal, it's a little bit more hook laden, but again, with their like song construction on this song in particular, and it's like over 7 minutes, it just feels very different. But again, it still feels like Immolation. That song in particular might have been worth like this entire EP for me. I love that song. I think it's kind of cool that they kind of stepped outside of, what they usually did and wrote something that definitely showcases the fact that they're just absolutely killer songwriters, regardless of whether or not they're just writing their straightforward, just amazing death metal, or they try something a little bit different. Like this sort of experimentation actually works. There's a couple of tracks on Shadows in the Light that I would probably yeet in favor of that track being on there, because I think it would have been like a big standout. Anyway, short EP, but really interesting. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if they did like another EP like this where they kind of experimented a bit, and then, of course, inevitably they would go back and just write a brilliant Immolation album, because that's what they do. I don't really want this band to like change that much. Like they can just keep doing their sound forever, because their sound, I think, is unique in death metal anyway. But this was kind of an interesting wrinkle in their discography in a way. Yeah, if you love Immolation, yeah, of course, get this. But yeah, this is a little bit different, and eventually I'm going to sit down and watch the DVD just because I'm just going to watch it. I mean, Immolation crushes live. I don't think that's even up for debate. But yeah, if you see this one lying around at your local CD store, snag it. It's good. It's a little bit different, but I mean, again, it's Immolation. It crushes. And finally, we have Insanity from the Grave. This is a compilation from this California-based death thrash act from the 80s. This includes a lot of demos as well as a re-recording of their 1993 full-length. Yet another blind buy. I just kind of saw the cover and was like, hey, you know what? This is worth getting for like, $5, $6. I can't remember how much I paid for it, but it really wasn't that expensive. And I thought this was interesting because finding out that this band was from the 80s and actually playing a more death metal centric sound at the time, like, along with bands like, Possessed, Slaughter, arguably even like early Creator, it was that faster, more aggressive thrash where it started to like kind of like border on a whole new sound altogether. And I really like that like transitional period in thrash where, at least here in the US, like death metal really came out of the thrash scene. And this was a really interesting listen. Now, the first 3 tracks are from an 85 demo, and then tracks 4 through 10 are the re-recording of their 1993 album, and then there's a collection of later demos that I think go from like 1994 all the way to 2005. On the archives, this band was listed as having a complicated history, so I think those later demos, they might be a little bit all over the place in terms of like lineup shifts and all that stuff. But anyway, the original demo, honestly, if this had come out around the same time as like, you know, Seven Churches and such, we'd probably be talking about it almost as much because very comparable. Granted, it's a 80s demo and I don't think they did much to it in terms of like improving its production because, man, it's raw. It's fucking filthy sounding. Very muddy, very staticky, especially the vocals. The vocals have this like broken microphone sort of sound where like, you know, you can't understand anything coming out of the PA. But man, the riffs are absolutely savage. You have these like more single kick blast beats throughout this. Like this is kind of like that same blast you would hear in like early DRI and Cryptic Slaughter and again, Seven Churches. Just a dude playing as fast and as violently as they possibly can. And then of course the riffs following suit. Ultimate Death in particular. That song is flat out vicious. So when I saw that their full-length Death After Death didn't come out until 1993, and again, this is a re-recording, I believe, done in 1997 of it, I was already like, man, that kind of came out really late because even at that point, you know, death metal was starting to wane a little bit. Thrash metal was pretty much getting crushed by grunge. So by the time that that came out, there was probably not much of a market for it, which is sad because the album itself is awesome. Musically, the album feels way more death metal. It still has a lot of thrash to it, like kind of like Eaten Back to Life, where a lot of people say, oh, Eaten Back to Life's more of a thrash metal album than a death metal album. I would totally disagree. It's a death metal album. It's kind of in that same vein where, again, it's fast, it's got its thrashy riffs, but there's definitely a vibe and an energy and a sound to it that definitely screams more death metal than anything else. The riff work is awesome. It's tight. It's aggressive. Some good harmonies on the song Possession in particular. The riff work on here is so fast. Like the picking speed is up there with like some of the fastest thrash albums you've probably ever heard. Like, you know, early Sadist and stuff like that, where it's just rapid fire all the time, like machine gun riffs, tremolos, but also like some, you know, technical flourishes every now and then. The songs overall are a little bit on the longer side, but there's tons of killer riff changes, and I have a feeling like that the whole thing was about momentum because at no point was I really bored listening to any of those tracks. Like they just keep going and they remain at this like fever pitch the entire time. I can appreciate that, especially when like, again, the riff work is so damn solid. Now, the later demos I thought were interesting, not only because they're good, I think they're well written as well. A little bit more, you know, drawn out, I would say, in terms of like the songs, like whereas the full length definitely had longer songs, I feel like, you know, they kept the momentum more. The later songs, there were points that, you know, you could have trimmed off a little bit and it really wouldn't have hurt the songs. But songs like Ritual and Extinction, I think, are absolutely killer as is. And the production value definitely got better on that one. It's a little uneven just because I think they were done at like different points. But still, baseline, I like the production. It kind of has that live quality overall. And this was a really fun find. And, you know, it was one of those like, you know, I feel like this band, maybe if they had kind of got the ball rolling on a full length a bit earlier, we might be talking about them a little bit more because the music's there, like 100%. Like this band probably would have been like in that same echelon again as like Possessed, Slaughter. Again, I'll throw in Sadist too. But for whatever reason, again, a complicated history, they didn't get a full length out until, well, around the time that this sound was kind of dying in a way. Still, if you have never checked this out, I strongly recommend it if, again, you're a fan of that kind of like proto death metal sound, that death thrash sort of vibe, like later 90s thrash where it started getting heavier and then just stuff that is definitely more death metal. Check this out. This was a really solid listen. And that is it for my first collection update of 2025. Already got a whole bunch of music here to go over. The next ones might be longer. I'm trying not to make these like too long just because I got a lot of other stuff that I'm working on. But yeah, plenty more to come in the way of collection updates. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe because we do stuff like this all the time. We also have memberships that are only 99 cents, and we offer a members-only live stream as our lone perk, which we will eventually get back to. We just had to wait for well, mostly John to feel better because that norovirus kicked his ass for a bit. But we'll make some announcements and figure out what we're doing, whether it's just a hangout chat or we'll actually talk about like a subject or whatever. Anyway, the memberships are the new way to support the channel more directly. We also have our store, thrallsmetal.com, with our t-shirts and hats. That is linked down below in the video description. And again, if you would like to become a member of this thing that we do, there's a join button somewhere down there. And of course, thank you guys so much for all of the love, all the support, everything. It's still absolutely amazing doing this. I know I say a lot of the same shit at the end of these videos, but I mean it. This is, again, one of the coolest things I think I've ever done with my life, no matter how sad or weird that sounds. Tons of content coming your way. Motley Crue is in the past. So glad we're on At the Gates next. I'm looking forward to that one infinitely more. Also, of course, more reviews, more States of Metal stuff, maybe try to like squeeze in a retro review too, and some discussion pieces that we're kind of working on too. But yeah, tons of content coming your way because you guys are absolutely awesome, and we will catch you later.